Special regard must be paid to agriculture. Although it hath been mentioned in the fifth place, unquestionably it preceded the others. Agriculture is highly developed in foreign lands. However, in Persia it hath so far been grievously neglected. It is hoped that His Majesty the Shah, may God assist him by his grace, will turn his attention to this vital and important matter. Baha'u'llah. Strive as much as possible to become proficient in the science of agriculture, for in accordance with the divine teachings, the acquisition of sciences and the perfection of arts are considered as acts of worship. If a man engages with all his power in the acquisition of a science or in the perfection of an art, it is as if he has been worshiping God in the churches and temples. Thus, as thou entereth a school of agriculture and strivest in the acquisition of that science, thou art day and night engaged in acts of worship, acts that are accepted at the threshold of the Almighty. What bounty greater than this, that science should be considered as an act of worship and arts a service to the kingdom of God? Abdul Baha.
Thank you. So today we're happy to have Dr. Stephen Worth, and he'll be talking about agriculture as the key to global prosperity, a Baha'i perspective. Stephen brings two things to the table: engaging creativity and over 40 years of experience in agricultural and rural development in Africa. He's worked in agricultural extension and development as a field practitioner and manager, and he's consulted with numerous agencies on capacity development, wealth creation, rural development, and agricultural extension and education. He recently retired as an associate professor in agricultural extension and rural resource management at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, UKZN, South Africa, where he also served as director of the African Center for Food Security. Previously, he served as academic leader, teaching and learning, and later as acting dean and head of the School of Agricultural, Earth, and Environmental Sciences. Stephen has developed and presented numerous training programs on agricultural and rural development, and co-authored and edited training manuals, occasional papers and books with the FAO, and has authored and co-authored over 40 published peer-reviewed articles. He's evaluated and developed curricula for numerous agricultural education programs, particularly in higher education. He's been the principal writer of several South African national policies in agricultural extension and agricultural education and training. Most recently, he assisted the FAO with developing programming framework for South Africa and setting up a farm business school system in Azerbaijan, including training of extension personnel as trainers and facilitators. In his retirement, Stephen is pursuing a range of work with the South African government, the FAO of the UN and UKZN, providing expert advice on agricultural education and training, policy development, and institutional evaluations. And he remains active in research and postgraduate supervision. So with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Worth.
Good afternoon. For me, it's good evening. I'm not sure I could live up to that introduction, but I will do my best. So first of all, I just want to extend my thanks to the Bahá'í family for inviting me to be a part of this really lovely family initiative. It is a really good example of translating ideas into action, which is actually a core element of this discussion. And a little shout out to my sister, Bambi Betts. Having always had more confidence in me than I do, she suggested my name to the family to be a part of this program. So today, we're going to explore a Baha'i perspective on agriculture as a key to global prosperity. And I say a Baha'i perspective because in the Baha'i faith, none of us has the right to give any official or authoritative I am right statement on any subject. So these are just my thoughts, which come from the experience that I've had in my life here in South Africa over the last 40 or so years. Agriculture and its role in global prosperity is a vast subject. And this is, in this first conversation, we will only really be able to touch on a few ideas. And to give this presentation some context, it will be helpful for those who you don't know to have at least a little understanding of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. And even that needs some context. All of us have grown up with some form of ideology. Generally, we either believe or do not believe in God. And those who believe in God have varying understandings of that concept. Baha'is believe that there has only ever been one God, who was the creator of all that is. and he is called by many different names and is worshipped or not in many different ways. Baha'is also believe that that one God created us from the same stock. Thus, in essence, all of humanity, with all its diversity of language, race, gender, culture, body type, and mentality, with all of its diversity, humanity is one people. Essentially, one family with God as our collective parent. So one God, one people. Thus, this one God has been educating this one people for thousands of years. God has taken us through many stages of development, physically, socially, politically, and spiritually. In the time of Adam, we were like infants, just discovering the uniqueness of our creation as something similar to but distinct from animals. We were developing our sense of individual unity, where we see ourselves as an integrated whole created in the image of God. We started the process of understanding the power and consequences of free will, which is our power of choice. Through the ages, as we very slowly matured, God would send a special educator to help us achieve the next stage in our individual and collective development. We know some of these educators: Abraham, Moses, Buddha, Krishna, Zoroaster, Christ, Muhammad. And now we have Baha'u'llah, the educator from God for our time. These educators brought essentially two sets of lessons from God. One set was pretty much the same: spiritual truths that will never change. There is a God, he is all-powerful, he is the creator of all things, he is the source of all knowledge, he is the source of love. They all taught that what makes us human is that we have an immortal, rational soul that for a time is associated with the physical frame. They all taught the fundamental virtues of love, respect, truthfulness, trustworthiness, courtesy, humility, and many, many others. The other set of lessons were lessons about how we should order our individual and collective lives. And through this, we have seen the ever-expanding physical spaces where we are able to work at least a fundamental form of unity. Unity of family, unity of the tribe of families, unity of nations, of tribes, to the current stage where we need to establish the unity of the entire planet. And as impossible as that may sound, given the behavior of national governments and leaders, it is not only possible, but inevitable. Isaiah saw it, Christ promised it, and Baha'u'llah has set out the blueprint for it. So the question is not if, but when. The other question is how. The general answer to this question from the Baha'i teachings is through a gradual process of spiritualizing the planet and shifting its value system to one of materialism, to one of coherence among material, social, spiritual, and economic aspects of life. A value system that recognizes the value of each within a coherent whole. A value system where choices are governed by deeply embedded principles emanating from the central principle of the oneness of humanity. These are all very elevated thoughts and concepts, and hard to imagine in a cynical materialistic world ruled largely by the admiration for power, the adoration of status, the love of luxuries, attachment to frivolous pursuits, the glorification of violence, and the obsession with self-gratification. But still, Baha'is firmly believe that it is not only possible, but inevitable. For Baha'is, this is a practical, not a magical reality. It is something we will have to build, and we'll have to struggle to build. And the only way we, as the Baha'is, can prove this is to offer potential patterns for a future civilization from which we can learn and through which we can build that kingdom of God on earth. One such pattern is found in the role of agriculture as it is expressed in the Baha'i teachings. The first teaching on agriculture comes from Baha'u'llah. He outlined 5 things which he said were the fundamental principles for the administration of the affairs of men. They included promoting international peace, establishing a common international language, promoting fellowship, kindness, and unity, training and educating children, and agriculture. Not only was agriculture among the 5 fundamental principles, Baha'u'llah went on to say that although he mentioned it in 5th place, unquestionably, it precedeth the others. This alone to me at least, is an astonishing thought. The first principle for the administration of the affairs of men is agriculture. And he told us to give special regard to agriculture. It precedes promoting international peace. It precedes establishing a common language. It precedes promoting fellowship, kindliness, and unity. It even precedes training, educating, and children. That's quite a statement, but it also makes really practical sense. I have tried to put together a little graphic on this practicality. So here we see the role and requirements, put very simplistically, of each of these 5 fundamental principles for administering the affairs of men. Starting with agriculture, we see that it creates food and nutrition security, and to do that requires a just agri-food system. International peace ensures political stability and safety for people and commerce. It requires a world governance system. A common language improves communication and fosters a shared culture. This will require the abandoning of all forms of prejudice. Fellowship, kindliness, and unity create the ethos for society. This will require the recognition of the oneness of humanity. Training and educating children ensures the future and ensures that civilization will be ever advancing. And this will require universal compulsory education. And while the details can be argued, and I recognize this is very, very simplistic, it is the concept that is important. We find in these 5 fundamental principles the basis for establishing and maintaining a world in which the well-being and peace and security is experienced by all the planet's inhabitants. And while they are presented as independent variables or elements, in reality, they are tightly interwoven. One cannot really be achieved without the others. Thus, Baha'u'llah said, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And he went on to say that this unity can never be achieved so long as the counsels of the pen of the Most High, that the pen of the Most High hath revealed, are suffered to pass unheeded. And these are the 5 fundamental counsels, all of which must be heeded. And given that context, we're going to look a little more closely at agriculture, the principle that precedes the others. The next idea about agriculture comes from the talks given in America in 1912 by Baha'u'llah's son, Abdul Baha. He had been appointed by Baha'u'llah as the one to whom all the Baha'i should turn after Baha'u'llah passed away. Baha'u'llah gave Abdul Baha the authority to interpret and explain Baha'u'llah's teachings, to help make them more accessible, and to help us learn how to apply them in our daily lives. So, Abdul Baha said in one of his talks in 1912, the fundamental basis of the community is agriculture, tillage of the soil. Then he also made a most curious statement. He said, the question of economics must commence with the farmer. It is fitting to begin with the farmer in matters related to economics, for the farmer is the first active agent in human society. Abdul Baha gave this some context. He said, first and foremost is the principle that to all the members of the body politic shall be given the greatest achievements of the world of humanity. Each one shall have the utmost welfare and well-being. Each one shall have the utmost welfare and well-being. To solve this problem, he goes on to say, we must begin with the farmer. There, we will lay a foundation for system and order, because the peasant class and the agriculture class exceed other classes in the importance of their service. And here we begin to see where what Baha'u'llah talks about agriculture being preceding the others, because he is saying clearly, Abdul Baha is saying clearly that when we start with the farmer, we will lay a foundation for system and order. And this is really a rather stunning collection of statements. Agriculture is the first principle for the administration of the affairs of men. The question of economics must commence with the farmer. To lay a foundation for a system and order to achieve the utmost welfare and well-being, we must begin with the farmer. And the agricultural or peasant class exceeds other classes in the importance of their service. So that means we need to update our little diagram about the agriculture element of our diagram about the 5 fundamental principles. We see now that while agriculture still has the practical role of ensuring universal food and nutrition security, it also creates the foundation for system and order to achieve universal welfare or prosperity and well-being. It still requires a just system, an agri-food system. But now we know that for it to be effective in being just, we must start with the farmer. And this is so because the farming class exceeds all other classes, presumably even politicians and entertainers, in the importance of their service. So we start at the bottom of the system. That's really very cool to me. And it's actually how the Baha'i faith operates. We work really from the grassroots up. And we're going to come back to this rather revolutionary idea in a moment about working with the farmer. But first, we want to take a look at agriculture itself. And what I have learned over the years is that agriculture is multifaceted. Most of us think of it as farming. Most of us think of it as production, but it is really quite more complex than that. It has a biological element that encompasses the raising of crops and animals for food, fiber, fuel, and medicine. It has an economic element in that it is at the center of a massive value chain and an even larger agri-food system. It has the fundamental function of providing food upon which is essential for life. And of course, it has a human element that requires farmers to manage the process of production, as well as all the other people along the value chain. And these things were fairly obvious. But what was so very interesting was the spiritual element of agriculture and its role in creating prosperity. It is in this element that I began to understand how agriculture is the key to global prosperity. So then we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by prosperity? And you can have many definitions, but from the Baha'i perspective, prosperity generally is seen as attaining sustained spiritual and material well-being, peace and security, of which all the planet inhabitants are beneficiaries. And you'll hear a lot of emphasis of all the planet's inhabitants, not some. Sure, food is important, but there are so many ways to produce food that the role of agriculture as the first principle in the administration of the affairs of men suggested something more subtle, something more fundamental than just food. You think about it. We have huge capacity for food production through industrialized agriculture. We scarcely need farmers to produce food. So why is agriculture up there and even in front of promoting international peace, establishing a common international language, promoting fellowship, kindness, and unity, and training of children? It has to be about something more than just food. In part, I think it is because agriculture and all that it entails is a nexus. Food, water, energy, social, political, economic, environmental, not unlike human beings that we are, a coherent whole that is spiritual and material. Agriculture, true agriculture, is a coherent whole, the approach to and the management of which give us a framework for coherent management of our collective and material social world. We see through the practical or the practice of agriculture, and especially through the malpractice of industrialized agriculture, how prosperity can be generated and maintained or destroyed. For agriculture to produce and deliver sustenance to the whole of the human population requires the application of the very spiritual principles Baha'u'llah says are needed to create global prosperity. And that brings us back to the principle of Abdu'l Baha that we must begin with the farmer. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key elements of agriculture as a key to solving the economic problem so that each one shall have the utmost welfare and well-being is Abdu'l Baha's advice that we start with the farmer. And note that he says farmer and not farm. And it took me 20 years to discover that ER. He said, start with the farmer, not with the farm. He didn't say not with the farm, but he said that we must start with the farmer. He did not say start with the farm. Sure, the farm is important, but the core of agriculture is a human being. For decades and decades, we have approached agriculture from the perspective of the farm, the land, production, productivity, technology. All of this is indeed important. But in all the years we have been doing this, we still have not cracked agriculture development that leads to widespread prosperity, especially not for smallholder farmers who produce so much of the food the world consumes. So to me, it is because we start conversations and our research and our plans about agriculture and for agriculture with the farm. We should have started those conversations with the farmer. That's the key. And it is here that I learned about this key. The human being has a dual nature, a material nature, our bodies, and a spiritual nature, our souls. And it is in this interplay, especially the development of the soul, that creates the foundation for prosperity. So I guess in a way, I am saying that we need to give agriculture a soul. We need to link its spiritual purpose of link it to its spiritual purpose of laying the foundation for a system and order. And the only way to do this is to start with the farmer. For it is the farmer who can initiate the process of imbuing spiritual principles into the production of food, fiber, and fuel, and passing that along through the value chain, in the same way that it is the farmer who initiates the material process of producing food, fiber, and fuel, and passing that on through the value chain. So I'm going to back up a little bit here and just see if I can find it. Agriculture needs to be spiritualized in a sense. We have seen over the years that we have not started with the farmer. We have started with the land. We ask us, how much land have you got? How can you produce? What can you produce? Even to the point that we will move farmers off their land and we will farm for them so that we can get that production. And so we go for short-term production over the long-term building of capacity, which is essential to the development of a system, of systems and order. So, as I said, we need to start with this farmer, and it is the farmer who can initiate the process of imbuing spiritual principles into the production of food, fiber, and fuel, and pushing that on through the value system. And what is interesting among Baha'u'llah's teachings is the foremost principle being trustworthiness. And of this, Baha'u'llah says, the door of security, trustworthiness is the door of security for all that dwell on earth. Trustworthiness is the greatest portal leading unto the tranquility and security of the people. The stability of every affair hath depended and doth depend upon it, trustworthiness. It is the supreme instrument for the prosperity of the world. And so there we hear that word prosperity again. So we know that in order for us to bring prosperity and to lay the foundation and system for bringing prosperity to everyone on the planet, we must start with the farmer. We also know that the supreme instrument for prosperity is trustworthiness. So there is a link between creating trustworthiness in the farmer and in the system at which he is at the beginning point, so that it pushes through the entire food system, agri-food system. So imagine, can you imagine a food system based on trustworthiness? How it would change? How it would change just about everything. How farmers treat the environment, the air, the water, the soil, how they deal with pests, how they deal with markets, how the markets deal with farmers, how the markets deal with customers or consumers, and how consumers deal with markets, and how governments at all levels govern the food system. If we just injected this one spiritual principle of trustworthiness into the farmer, whereas the place that we start in order to develop the system and the foundation for the delivery of universal prosperity, it would start raising the question of, should I grow this? Should I grow it this way? What will this do if I plant it this way, or use this kind of treatment in terms of chemicals or fertilizers, or how is this going to affect the environment? What should I do about the pests? Should I go for the best price and try and gouge my customers? What about the markets? Are they trying to get the cheapest product possible so they can make the most profit out of the farmers? And how does the market deal with the customers? Are they selling them things they don't need? Are they selling them at prices that are too high? And how do the consumers deal with markets? Oh, it's so cheap. I'm so glad it's so cheap, not knowing that the reason it's cheap is because they paid the farm labor for too little money, could not live. So you can see just the introduction of the concept of trustworthiness, where I have to be truthful. I have to be thinking about the whole system, can have a massive change on the way our agri-food systems work. And of course, imagine trustworthiness and how it would impact on how governments at all levels govern the agri-food system. Right now, if you look around the world, you will see that it's very skewed. Governments interfere all over the world with production prices, with interventions, with tariffs, with subsidies that skew the prices and the availability and accessibility of food and fiber. And we have seen how food is used as a weapon. And I am not just talking about the Ukraine war. It is everywhere. How it is processed, who controls it, how much it costs, who has access. It's all used as a weapon. You can look into the politics of any country in any part of the world, and you will see how food is used as a weapon to control populations. Imagine if the local, national, and continental world food system had as its primary purpose to ensure that every human being had fair access at all times to the food required to sustain a healthy, active, and productive life. Imagine if that was their goal in terms of trustworthiness. It's quite an astonishing thought. And so really that's kind of where the agriculture part ends, is just to think about these two concepts of, if we want to create prosperity, we start with the farmer. And if we start with the farmer, we must introduce this spiritual aspect of starting with trustworthiness as the foundation. But I want to return to the point on unity, which is the fundamental teaching of Baha'u'llah. We read already Baha'u'llah's clear statement about the centrality of unity in the achievement of prosperity, where he says the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. The word unity evokes many concepts: solidarity, strength in numbers, shared vision, collective action, all of which are true. But the core meaning of the word is the state of being one, joined as a whole. Unity speaks to the concept of coherence, which is the quality of forming a whole. This is particularly important in the agri-food system. Currently, the system is set up on the basis of competition. Farmers must compete with each other. Farmers compete with suppliers and markets over prices. Consumers compete over access and prices. And there is very little evidence of people seeing the coherence of the agri-food system. there is very little unity, and there's very little trustworthiness. So it is not surprising that there is very little prosperity for most of the world, because food is such a fundamental aspect of life, and because we depend on agriculture for that food, it offers a powerful space for creating unity and coherence and fostering trustworthiness as the foundation of economic practice. And as improbable as it sounds, it actually can start with the farmer. But it requires us to change our understanding of this creature called farmer. It requires us to accept that the farmer exceeds all of us, non-farmers, in the importance of their service. It requires us to see the farmers as the first active agent in human society. It requires the farmers to see themselves that way. And that's a big challenge. And the work that I've done over the years, our biggest challenge is to help the farmers see themselves as equal players in a system that puts them at the lowest end, where their main job is to produce or to provide low-cost raw materials for a very wealthy system from which they are excluded. And they see themselves as that's their destiny in life. So this idea of starting with the farmer requires the farmers themselves to see their own inherent nobility and their own ability to contribute to the welfare of mankind, and recognizing, not in an arrogant or egotistical way, but recognizing the importance of their service. It requires that the focus of agriculture development, while acknowledging the value of technology, must be on developing the capacity of farmers in their role as the first active agents of society. It requires us to live in unity with the environment and to be trustworthy in that regard. In this presentation, I have really only just touched on this concept of agriculture as the key to global prosperity. There are many technical, technological, economic, and social aspects to be explored, every one of which will require a massive change in the way things are done. And perhaps one day we'll be able to discuss those as well. But this is just a taste of the reason that agriculture is the key to global prosperity. There have been, by the way, a number of papers published and articles written about with Baha'i perspectives on agriculture. You can find some of them at the Baha'iTeachings.org. I do want to say one last thing before I close. It's my cautionary note. There is no magic bullet. This is not going to happen with a single change of a government policy or a single change of one person being more conscious of the environment or the way things are made and what to buy and what not to buy. Like all sustainable processes, it requires a fundamental shift in the perception at the foundation of the agriculture system. And as Abdul Baha said, if we want to solve this problem, we actually have to start with the farmer. So thank you. That's my little input for tonight. And I'm hoping that has given you some food for thought. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to discuss them with you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting and really an important topic. So we appreciate it. So everyone can put their questions in the chat now, and we'll have some time to have those answered. The first question is, can you speak to this idea that Abdul Baha puts forward about having agriculture in the center of future towns and cities, and how this will help the development of communities in the future?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. It comes up a lot. And what I've been able to figure is, people look at this from different perspectives. They say it's predictive in the sense that future world societies will be smaller communities with more agrarian. And so he provides a very descriptive process that can happen. But what is interesting is when he describes that process, and it's generally around what he calls the general storehouse. He also says this is how it would work in a village, but in larger cities, it would have to be on a larger scale. So clearly he says, he's not saying cities are going to disappear and we're only going to have villages. He also makes an interesting comment. He says that everyone must produce. And he says it right after a statement that he says about agriculture. But any economist knows that no society can be built with everybody producing their own food, because teachers are needed and they won't have time to produce their own food. They have to rely on somebody else. So diversified economies are still there. In addition to that, in the quotations that Bayan read this at the beginning of this program, he talks about arts and sciences, right? So society is not only going to be agriculture. It's certainly going to be an important part of it, because Baha'u'llah himself says that it's the first of the five fundamental principles of the administration of the affairs of men. How it will meet itself out in a future society depends on how we develop that society. So yes, there will be probably greater attention paid to smallholder agriculture. There will be probably less attention paid or less support of these multinational conglomerate food distributors who process all of our food. Abdul Baha has many comments about food quality and seasonal production and things like that. So we have some hints as to how it will happen. But he also, when he wrote his book, Secret to Divine Civilization, he also chided the people of Iran, Persia at the time, for not being willing to adopt modern technologies. All right, so he's not saying we must go back to the hoe or back to to plant one seed. He's not saying that. Well, he's trying to get us to find this coherence. You will find me actively avoiding using the word balance, because balance requires that there's an opposition. There's a dichotomy I'm trying to figure out. We live in a coherent world now, where these things are all part of a whole. There's going to be technology and there's going to be values around that technology. So mercy and justice, and many of the things, labor and capital, many of these things that have defined the way we look at economies are all going to change. And so whether agriculture is physically at the center is unlikely, because agriculture generally needs to be further out. We also have descriptions of the magical Azkar that tell us it'll be at the center, right? So center, is he talking physically, or center, is he talking metaphorically, that it's a clear focus, that central to our life, one of the 5 things that we need to be sure we're doing right is agriculture. Just like we must be sure that we're doing education correctly. Just to be sure that we must be hanging on to the ethos of kindliness and fellowship and unity. And we must be hanging on to international peace, and we must create that or establish that common language. If we don't, and common language, by the way, applies universally, but also it's very hard to find a common language in agriculture or in education or in science, right? So each of these things becomes the center of a community. That's how I see it, is that they're probably more guiding about how we think about these things rather than a physical structure of a community.
The next question is, do you see farmers markets in places like Phoenix, Portland, Knoxville, and Durham as a manifestation of some farmers' realization of the importance of agriculture and a desire to create their own markets instead of subordinating themselves to the huge agribusiness system?
Well, I suppose that depends on the motivation of the farmers, whether they're looking for more profits or I'm not sure. I can't speak for the farmers in Portland. But I do know that there is a growing movement of awareness that the system is rigged against the smallholder farmer. And that I will give you a little story. Some years ago, I think it was about 6 years ago, I was asked by the Food and Agriculture Organization to do an evaluation of the extension services in Lesotho. Anybody know where Lesotho is? Tiny, tiny little country surrounded by South Africa. Yeah, there's one person, Kathy, knows where Lesotho is. Tiny, tiny little country that is the only African country in the that has EU certified mohair. And mohair is a product of goats. And amongst the many farmers that I spoke with goat farmers about goat farming. Well, really about their lives and their livelihoods. And this one farmer was telling me how wonderful it was that 10 years ago he had 10 goats And now he has 20 goats. And how wonderful it was that the government had set up a scheme that allowed them to, that someone would come in and grade and help them improve their mohair, et cetera, et cetera. And so he showed me the receipts that he got for what he had sold, and it was 2 or 3 times as much as he ever had before. If you know anything about the mohair system in the mohair market or in South Africa, mohair is processed by a company in South Africa, in the city of Port Elizabeth, and the people who run it make a lot of money. So while the farmer was getting more, he was still really being treated as a source of cheap raw material for someone else to make a lot of money. So after I had done this evaluation, I went back to the government and I said, look, you can't, yes, it's wonderful that you've done this improvement of mohair production, but how come the farmer doesn't own part of that market? How come he doesn't get money, some kind of percentage of the downward market? This is what Abdul Baha said we must do, is profit share, right? They're not sharing that profit. So I think, and now apparently Lesotho has developed a Lesotho-based processing unit that at least creates some value adding, which is a great step forward, and it's apparently partly farmer owned. But my point is, I think that there is an awakening around the world of the need to put these large corporate companies into check, and to get them to recognize that they're poisoning us with additives. They're addicting us with sugar. They are, what can I say? They're beguiling us with flashy adverts that we need these things. And hence, in a world that produces more food than it needs, we have countries where people are literally starving, and we have countries with morbid obesity. This just shows that there is no unity within the system. This just shows that there is no trustworthiness. There is no central goal for agriculture to be the foundation of the system, a foundation for order that delivers universal prosperity. So yeah, you'll get to know me. No question will I ever answer short. I think that there's an awakening. The same thing happened with organic farming, by the way, in the upstate New York, where the organic farmers were being beaten out by the organic control system. So they went, well, we're no longer organic, we're natural. Come and see, farmers, because they recognize that unless you introduce this concept of trustworthiness and honesty, and everybody's in this together, somebody's going to try and rip you off because they want the profits, because they're not interested in anyone else, because the unity doesn't exist. So yeah, I'm sure there are many people who go to those farmers markets in those towns saying, I want a more honest deal. I want to meet my farmers. There are farmers in Canada, for example, in I think it's somewhere near Winnipeg or Manitoba, I can't remember which, where they have gotten together with the restaurants, and they deliver directly to restaurants, and they bypass the middleman because they recognize there's more value add for them, right? And so they can get together. So yeah, I think these things are growing. But no one yet has really twigged to the idea that it really fundamentally, you got to start with the farmer, build trustworthiness in, understand his foundational or her foundational role for establishing the foundation for order and the system. That's one of the 5 pillars of administering the affairs of men. I don't think anybody understands how important this is. So there's only 5 of them. He lists 5, agriculture's on the top, pretty cool.
Is veganism important for this process?
Veganism. Hey, my son is, again, veganism is another name, another label, right? And my son was vegan. And now he just says, I'm basically plant-based. And I asked him, why did you make the change? And he said, because mention vegan, you think weird things about people. You think absolutes. It's dichotomous, it's dividing. So we know there are some statements from Abdul Baha who talk about the physiology of our teeth is more inclined towards grains and nuts and things like that. And yet Baha'u'llah confirms that it's okay to hunt for meat. So we're not living in a world of extremes. Baha'u'llah has not come to create, you mustn't do this or mustn't do that in extremes when it comes to diet. He's removed almost all the dietary restrictions of the previous revelations. And he asks us to be wise. Remember, the number one context of Baha'u'llah's revelation is the coming of age of mankind. And the whole thing about becoming an adult is you got to make up your own mind based on the application of the spiritual principles and adhering to whatever laws there are of doing or not doing certain things. So does veganism? No. Is plant-based important? Yes, of course. There's a place for looking at a less red meat consumption. We understand the relationship between red meat production and methane and global, the CO2 levels and climate change and all that. But does that mean we'll never eat meat again? No, I don't think so. Meat is not a villain. Vegetables are not the heroes. It's about a coherent whole. And for people like me, okay, like I went on my son's vegan thing and I put on like 20 pounds in 3 weeks because it's all carb based, right? Okay, so I had to go off of it, otherwise I would have died, whereas other people can do that. So to prescribe, Baha'u'llah doesn't prescribe these things. He suggests, he says, consider, it's the same thing. There's no war between allopathic and alternative medicines. Look at it, all of it. When my arm gets broken, I do not want to pray over it. I want it set. It's just that kind of thing, right? So yeah, I understand this drive towards a healthier diet, and there's an aspect of that that Baha'u'llah encourages, but he doesn't say you must. I think you have to use wisdom, and you have to know how your body works and how your family works and how the system in your community works and how the farming system in your community works. Try doing all that in Botswana. Really hard to grow anything in Botswana. Although it's getting pretty hard to grow things in Central Valley in California with all the saline problems they've got with the aqueduct. So,
Yes.
I've been around a long time, guys,
What approach to microagriculture do you recommend for people who live in apartments?
Approach to microagriculture. You really should have invited my wife to discuss this, because the irony in our household is that I deal with farmer training and education. She actually is. I wish I could take you outside and you could see. We have a what she calls a regenerative farm in our suburban plot of 1,800 square meters. So what I will tell you is, if you need to see what is available, what's possible for you to do. If you live in a small apartment, you're not going to be able to grow very much. So grow things that are interesting, like herbs. Grow things that you use on an everyday basis that don't require a lot of space or a lot of water or a lot of attention. But don't think that you're going to be able to feed yourself from a plant box on your balcony. That's why we have diversified economies. If you left farming to me, you would all starve to death. Okay, but my wife, maybe you would have a nice meal, but if you live in an apartment and you want to be part of that, you must produce. Well, produce something you can produce. Another thing I did once when I was living in Fresno, California, we had a hydroponic unit in our flat. Really, really cool idea, except that I got the carpets wet all the time. So maybe not such a cool idea. But what I'm saying is that you can look at your space, look around you and say, okay, what can I do? And the real question is, how do I do it honorably? How do I do it without poisoning, introducing harmful chemicals? How do I do it without creating attracting flies that my neighbors might get upset with, like people like compost heaps, well, that's really nice, but what if it attracts flies or rats and things? So it's about being conscious about how what you're doing impacts on others, not just, oh, I like doing this, so I'm going to do it. It's, well, what are my neighbors going to think about this? And let's talk, and maybe together we can get a collective garden. And then we suddenly start building unity and collective action rather than just me wanting to grow something. Just a thought.
Is the move towards organic crops a sign of progress?
Okay, so interesting enough, we're moving away from organic crops now. We're moving towards regenerative agriculture, which has to do with a more holistic understanding of farming systems. And again, the concept of organic has been corrupted with marketing and commercialization. So it is progress in the sense that people are waking up to the reality that what I'm being sold in the shops may not be the best for me, and I better start reading those labels. And even when they say it's good for me, like it's fat free. Yeah, it may be fat free, but it's high in salt or high in something else, right? So they're marketing the lack of fat, but not the high in some other terrible thing. So I do think the interest in organics, the interest in veganism, the interest in whole products is an awakening of the individual and hopefully families to the understanding I actually have to be a player in this. I have to be a conscious participant in this process. I cannot just be, oh, they said it's the cheapest brand, I'll buy it. And you discover that it's 90%, sawdust or something. So yeah, I think it is one of the many signs that people are beginning to wake up that I actually have a responsibility as an adult to take responsibility for the decisions that I make and to read the labels and to find out where this product came from. And if that shirt or that crop is so cheap, how much did you pay your laborers? Can you tell me that? Because if you can't tell me that, and there are some places, by the way, that market, they will be able to tell you that apple came from that farmer in that place, and he earned so much off of this apple. There are marketing systems that now do that. They're hugely difficult to manage, but yes, it's a sign of the awakening of the ownership of the system. And as I said, one of the changes that has to take place when you introduce trustworthiness is, how does the consumer think about the market? How does the consumer think about the farmer? How does the consumer think about the whole system? Or is he just thinking, oh, I can get it cheaper now? Which is what we've been told to look for, cheapest price.
Abdu'l-Baha said spiritual solutions to economic problems, and Baha'u'llah said, tell the rich of the midnight sighing of the poor. Could this encourage us to support the many Baha'i grassroots tree and agriculture projects around the world? Shogi Effendi was the first lifetime member of the International Tree Foundation, still planting trees globally over 100 years.
Well, yes, I think, the Baha'is have several sets of responses to this, okay? One response is, what do I do in my own family? Is there justice in my family? And I say that, you might laugh and say that, but in this country, when we were helping many years ago, when we were going through a drought and we were giving food parcels out to families that had no food, we discovered that all the protein went to the men, and that the women and the girls ate last. And we also, not from this country, but they also did studies on the people who came into the refugee camps from the Sahel region into Kenya, that it wound up being mostly boys and men because the girls didn't get food along the way. So this idea of the poor, well, what do we mean by poor and who? So yes, it may well be that there are opportunities for us to look around our neighborhood. One of the things that our Universal House of Justice told us is for us to be cautious of being a happy, united, loving, joyful community, but living at a comfortable distance from the realities experienced by the masses of humanity. So there's very definitely a mandate to get out there and do what I call get uncomfortably close. And if you know anything about my household, we're very uncomfortably close. So yes, there should be a personal, family, community response to the poor around you. We also need, as Baha'i community, to be involved in changing the way systems are run, which is why I spent a great deal of time working in policy and education programs to try and add, to have that reach go further. Joining societies and clubs, sure, but don't, my personal advice is don't let them distract you from the core work of trying to reach people and to be imbued with the sense of the spiritual qualities that are needed to transform the whole of society. Because it's easy for us to say, I did good by sending World Wildlife Fund $100. And that's great. And they're a wonderful organization. I do contribute to them as well. My eldest son is a huge game conservation person in Mozambique. So I know he's watching, but don't let it become the only thing that you do. We have a big mission, material and spiritual. And if you're just helping people with money, you're probably not helping them out of poverty. You're probably entrenching them in it. Because you're not helping them build the capacity. The first of which is, I am an active agent in my own life, and I need to step up and live in the world of the mankind having come of age, and not live in the world of somebody else must sort this out for me.
Mega corporations are controlling most of agriculture and seeds around the world. Climate change and wars/civil wars are adding to the mix. How do farmers extract themselves out of these?
Well, as I said at the end of my little presentation, the process is going to be very, very slow, and there's going to be a lot of losses along a lot of casualties along the way. No growth, no change has ever come without a high price of human life. And I don't mean necessarily that people will physically die, maybe they will too. But, you know, just like the Christians had to be thrown to the lions and the Babis had to be martyred, to change systems requires people to be willing to lay down their lives for a different, for a change. And so how can they extricate themselves? So you take, for example, what happened in India when the government was passing new laws about the prices of food there, and they just went on a massive protest against their government, and the government never backs down in India. It never, that's just too big, who cares? They backed down. Okay, it took them 6 months and people died and people went hungry and they lost their jobs, they lost their farms, but they realized if we don't do this, then we are dead, we're slaves forever. And you know, one of the worst things that ever happened to the world was the Green Revolution in India. It looked so great until we discovered how it happened and what effects it had. And that's why they went on the protest, because those people were the ones who were the victims of the Green Revolution that brought so much production at a high cost to the environment and the smallholder farmers. So how do they extricate themselves? I don't know that they can in the short term, but they can set the process in motion of extricating the system by being the ones who stand up and say, I'm willing to sacrifice for this change. And it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's not short term, and it's going to take centuries for us to get this right. I'm sorry to say that, but it's not my words. This process is not going to be easy because the conglomerates have massive power. And unless we are willing to simply say no en masse, you know, you see, that's another of our problems. We're all big on like mass production, where really we should have been focused on production by the masses. Right. And so the same thing is that we need to have the masses arise to say enough. And this happened. We had riots here in South Africa a couple of years ago, really bad ones. And schools were burned and shops were burned, but there was one school in a township near me. They had just built it, and against police orders, against advice of security people, the mothers and the fathers literally linked arms to each other and stood in front of the school entrance and said, "We dare you to come in." And that was one of the only schools that didn't get touched, because the community decided they were willing to risk themselves to save the school that they had spent 20 years raising money to build. So yeah, that's how it will happen. The willingness to step up and make the sacrifice. It won't be easy though. And there won't be a lot who will do it, because there's a lot of reasons not to. There's a lot of reasons not to, and a lot of rewards for caving in.
Is food shortage being manufactured?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I'm not sure what they mean by manufactured. The food shortage exists, but it is a result of the lack of a coherent agri-food system. It's the result of the lack of unity. It's the result of putting my interests over your interests. It's the result of corporates, of the value chain saying, I want to get it the cheapest that I can. It's the result of governments trying to protect the interests of their farmers to gain votes, you know, by subsidizing different crops or even not producing. So it's a very complex situation. And one of the problems is that most of the food shortages, we live in a global society. I mean, well, not really in a global society, but we live in a global mechanism, an economy that is still governed by 19th century politics. And so we have the nations fighting with nations in a system that's trying to work globally. And so we have tariffs, and we have the need to support the farmers in this country, which countermands the farmers in another part of the world. So you can land a chicken in this country cheaper from Brazil than you can grow one here because of the way the subsidy system works in Brazil. So not just food shortages, but many things. It's not that they're manufactured like the world got together and said, oh, let's create a food shortage. It's the results of the lack of the unification of the nations coming together and saying, we need to do this together. And we need to hear the midnight sighing of the poor together. And we need to understand the system together has to be changed. And we have to stop taking the lobbying money, and we have to stop taking the, we're here, and if you read what Baha'u'llah writes about how ministers of state should behave, yeah, so manufactured in a sense, but I don't think anyone deliberately says, let's make a food shortage. I think it's the results of not caring if it results in a food shortage as long as I wind up rich. So we look at what happened with COVID, and while the economies around the world crashed, the personal economies of the 10 or 20 richest people in the world quadrupled because they are above and beyond the economies of the world. They live off of tragedy now. So food security, food shortage, doesn't matter to them. They'll make money off of it. You don't have food? Great. I have this package. It'll cost you 10 times as much and have little nutrition in it, but it'll make me rich and you happy 4 or 5 minutes. So yeah, I manufactured not necessarily deliberately, but I think it is the result of the disunity of nations living in a global economy managed by 19th century politics.
How engaged are women in agriculture in South Africa?
In South Africa, yeah. Okay, well, again, that depends on what you call agriculture. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 80% of the women are involved in agriculture in some way or another. In South Africa, there's a big push for women farmers. They all tend to be fairly smallholder. It all tends to be in that space of maintaining a level of not really engaging with the economy. Can you please produce enough for yourself? In other words, stay poor, or enough for us at a cheap price so we can get rich. So there are many women in agriculture in South Africa. There's a big push. Our national minister is a woman, and she's quite serious about these things. But the system isn't really designed to support them. Women don't own land here. It's still difficult for women to get loans from banks without their husband's signatures. They don't inherit. So we have equality in our constitution of men and women, but not in the practice of the way cultures work. And so, yes, there are women farmers, but they tend to earn less, produce less into the market, and they tend to be herded into a space that says, grow something for your children at home. Nice. You're a little girl. Sorry, I'm not the nicest when it comes to, I'm not gonna sugarcoat. The world does not treat women farmers well, period. Just like the world does not treat women well, period.
Someone asked, what's up with very wealthy people buying up farmland?
Well, yeah, what's up? They know that the foundation is the farmer. So I'm going to be one, because if I control the food, I control the world, right? So yeah, of course. Why that's it's one of the 5 things of administering the affairs of men, and I want to administer those affairs. So I will own one of the pillars. What's the other one that's happening? Private schools. I want to own the education system, right? What else is happening? I mean, so they're buying up literally the 5 principles Baha'u'llah wrote, because they are the source of how affairs of men are administered. So yeah, that's what's up with that. Power to control the system, because they understand its influence, how much leverage that will give them in creating their own wealth, their own security, because, as my brother would say, they're afraid to die. So they're trying to find ways to live forever, because they have no spiritual frame. So they're just afraid to ever die.
Does the spiritualization of agriculture relate to the economic solution is divine in nature, meaning that religion alone can, in the last resort, bring in man's nature such a fundamental change as to enable him to adjust the economic relationships of society?
Wow. Okay, that was a well-crafted question. I think we know from Baha'u'llah's teachings that he says that the the surest way to maintain the order of the world is to follow the laws of God, and to follow his teachings. I think the difficulty that people have with the word religion is that they see church or synagogue or mosque or something, and they see the box, they don't see the spiritual teaching. So at the beginning of my presentation, I went to some length to talk about the manifestations of these educators coming to help us with our material and social and political and spiritual development as we move from childhood into infancy into adulthood. So it's religion in the sense that God provides us with the qualities that he wishes that we would acquire. And he's made it clear that one of the 5 things we have to do is pay special attention to agriculture. And Abdu'l-Baha has told us that we have to start with the farmer, and we have been told that the trustworthiness is the key to prosperity. So there's a link between these things. So yes, the short answer is, of course, religion has always been the thing that will cause the transformation of society. That is the whole point that these educators come. But it's not religion in the priest said so. It's the religion in that I've heard the voice of God, I've heard what he's asked me to do, and I'm arising nobly to fulfill that obligation that's set before me, and to let go of those things that I like doing, but are contrary to my wishes. What does he say? Sorrow not if things contrary to wishes are destined for you. To let go of the things that you like doing that perhaps are not good for the well-being of mankind, even if you like them. So yes, of course, religion will be the transformation point, but how it's done has to be by the awakening of the individuals and moving them into collective, not because someone at the top has administered this down at the bottom. That will not work.
And then someone asked, so is it right to understand that unless the majority of the population follows the teachings of Baha'u'llah totally and collectively, it will be difficult to have true prosperity?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because one of the things that we have seen happen over the last 25 years within the Baha'i community is the direction of the Universal House of Justice, our governing body, international governing body, pushing us outward, saying we must have an outward-looking focus. And the barriers between Baha'i and not Baha'i are dissolving very rapidly, except in a very few spaces, like who votes and who gives to the fund, that kind of stuff. They're asking us all to recognize that, Baha'u'llah said that the twin duties are to recognize and obey, in other words, to see this teacher from God and to follow his teaching. So there are some people who recognize him as, wow, he had some really good things to say, I'll try those things. Well, that's a form of recognition. There are others who are really like 100,000% in, and are more directly committed to the cause itself. But the House of Justice says all are welcome and all should be invited to participate and to contribute. And I look at it like this: a baby is born and he recognizes his mother primarily as a source of food and comfort. And then he recognizes her as a source of authority. And then he recognizes a source of irritation, and then he recognizes her. And so the concept of recognition grows. And so when someone comes into contact with who the manifestation of God is, he will recognize him for something. That's okay, the starting point. And then that will grow. And so the idea of you must all become Baha'is in order for this to work, I'm not so sure that's not what we're worried about. What we're worried about is that the qualities that Baha'u'llah brought, the teachings that he brought, the spiritual infusion that he brought, that permeates society. The religion will catch up with it. We're not overly concerned. I don't think we're overly concerned with that part. If you've ever read the book, A Brief Introduction to the Baha'i Faith by Mujan Momin, he actually writes in the introduction of that saying, if I had written this book 30 years ago, I would have talked about the principles that Baha'u'llah brought. Now everybody talks about them, so they're nothing new. So I have to talk about something else, and he talks about personal happiness. So that's because the qualities, the teachings, the principles that Baha'u'llah brought are slowly being adopted, and therefore prosperity will come through the application of those principles. And many of them will become Baha'is, and many won't. We're talking hundreds of years.
Do you see the production of biogas as a key to our energy requirements, an antidote to the electricity crisis?
Certainly not an antidote, but it certainly is one of the many things that we should be looking at. Again, it depends on how those biogases are being produced. So what's the ethics around it? What are the chemicals being used to produce the biomass that's used to produce that? So, yes, it is theoretically is a good use of a renewable source of energy, but I was just watching a video. My son was showing me he's a what do they call them? A person who studies physics. A physicist, right? And he was showing me about wave energy and how they've changed the way that they collect energy for the waves. So in the ocean. So I think we must explore, Abdu'l-Baha says, explore all these modern things, but do so with an eye of integrity, with an eye of trustworthiness, with your eye on the oneness of mankind. You want to read an interesting PhD, read the PhD of Dr. Hugh Bond, whose thesis was on what if technology were developed with the operating system being the principle of the oneness of mankind. What would the technology look like? Can you imagine if people made that technology, I can do this, but should I? Or if I do this, how can I make it benefit mankind? Right? So, because we know from Baha'u'llah's teachings is that education is important, but only if it's generated to the benefit of mankind. Right? So the biogas, sure. As long as it's done correctly, ethically, no one tries to corner the market on it, or to shortchange the farm workers who have to do the work. It's one of the ones that should be done. But is it the silver bullet? No, there's going to be many bullets to find alternative energy. And as Baha'u'llah says, Shoghi Effendi says, untapped and unsuspected resources on this planet. Unsuspected resources. We have no idea. We know more about space than we do about the oceans. Unsuspected resources. So yeah, it's one, but not the only. We don't live in the world of there's an answer. We live in the world of let's look for all the answers and weave them together in a coherent, unified system that benefits mankind, driven by hearing the midnight sighing of the poor, so that sighing goes away.
What do you think about the idea of consuming the produce that grows in the area you live in? Is that more healthy?
Is it more healthy? Well, okay. Again, these things are laced with all kinds of caveats, but the idea that it is better for the environment to have a smaller carbon footprint, and as much as you can consume from where you are. But I'm not going to begrudge a person from Botswana wanting to buy an imported banana, because there will be no bananas in Botswana, right? So again, no extremes. So yes, to the extent that you can, try and reduce your carbon footprint. But is it healthier? That depends on how it's been grown. Was it grown with pesticides? Was it grown with synthetic fertilizers? Was it grown with paying a fair wage to the laborer? What do we call, what is healthy? Materially healthy, physically healthy, spiritually healthy, economically healthy? So these things, agriculture is massively complex because everything we eat has a multitude of tendrils that run out. So we cannot have simplistic views of, just buy local. Well, yeah, that's what happens here in our townships. Everybody buys at the spaza shop at 20 times the price you could buy it if you walked into town. That's buying local, but it's not fair to the people, right? So we're not a slogan faith. These are interesting ideas. We understand the principle behind buying local, but you got to check your facts before you just say it's always best. You don't know. My students hate this because I never will answer a question straight, by the way, as you can see.
How can we change the thinking so that girls and women get an equal share in education, food, and healthcare?
Well, Abdu'l-Baha is very clear about that. He says we must get men to own the equality of men and women. That's how we change it. It's not by educating, obviously we have to educate women, but it's not through the education of women that problem gets solved. It is through the education of men about the equality of men and women that gets solved. And the ownership of that is about changing the way that boys look at girls from the time they start looking at girls, and it's even before that, so that they are told, don't look at girls like that, So the way we can change that, again, slow process, is by mothers raising their sons to be respecters of women as equal, and fathers agreeing and supporting that and owning it. That's how, because that's what Abdul Baha said. We will only have that when the men own the equality of men and women. Can you tell I was raised by a mom? You know, we were a matriarchal family, so you know that was, yeah, I had no choice. But I think others were not given such a lovely opportunity in life as I had.
I think we've addressed all of the questions. Thank you. We really appreciated this talk. It was really interesting, and many people want you to come back, so we'll be in touch with you about that. Thank you so much again. Yeah, we really appreciated this.
Well, I have to tell you, you know, we had a lot of starts and stops, and we had dates set, and I was traveling, and I said, I'll do it in the airport. And I think, was it you or your mom who said, no, that's too risky, you know? But I have to tell you, I have not done these kind of things much. And I was quite anxious about it, because I talk a lot and I talk fast, and I have a lot of things to say, but it's been wonderful, really has. And if it's been of value, then I'm even happier.
Yes, it was very great. Thank you so much. So next week, our speaker will be Dr. Jean Parker, and the topic will be Emergency Preparedness Through Community Cohesion, a Baha'i Approach to Resilience. So again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I'll put the link to our contact form and YouTube channel in the chat. And we'll end with a Baha'i prayer set to music.
Create in me a pure heart, oh my God, and renew a tranquil conscience within me, oh my hope. Through the spirit of power, confirm thou me in thy cause. And by the light of thy glory, reveal unto me thy path. Let thine everlasting melodies breathe tranquility on me, and let the riches of thine ancient countenance deliver me from all except thee. Through the power of thy transcendent might, lift me up unto the heaven of thy holiness, whoa, source of my being. And by the breezes of thine eternity, gladden me, oh, thou who art my God. And let the tidings of the revelation of thine incorruptible essence bring me joy. Let thine everlasting melodies breathe tranquility on me, and let the
We'll see you next Saturday. Take care.